The sun over the Arizona territory was not merely a celestial body. It was a judgment. It hung high and white, in a sky so bleached of color that it looked like a sheet of heated iron, hammering down upon the dry scrub and the red dust with a relentless, physical weight. Abigail Whitlow felt it pressing against the back of her neck as she turned the handle of the windlass, the rusted metal groaning in protest. The bucket rose from the dark throat of the well, heavy and sloshing with water that smelled faintly of copper and deep earth. She was 19 years old. In the eyes of the dusty settlement of Copper Creek, she was a woman grown. Yet she remained suspended in a state of preserved innocence that felt increasingly fragile, like a porcelain cup rattled by the vibrations of a passing freight train. Her hands, though calloused from the washboard and the garden hoe, were steady as she poured the water into the wooden pail. She paused, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and looked toward the southern horizon. A sound cracked the silence. It was faint, a dry pop like a branch snapping under a heavy boot. But it did not belong to the trees. It was a gunshot. Then came another, and a third, rolling off the distant canyon walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. Abigail stood frozen, the water dripping from the ladle onto her boots. It was 1874. Gunfire was not uncommon, but the cadence of this was wrong. It was not the rhythmic bark of a hunter bringing down a deer, nor the celebratory fire of cowboys riding into town on a Saturday night. This was jagged, angry fire. It was the sound of men killing men. She gripped the handle of the pail, her knuckles white. The talk in town for the last 3 weeks had been nothing but poison. The miners spoke of Apache raids on the supply wagons. The soldiers at the garrison spoke of broken treaties. And the men in suits, the ones who came from the east with maps and measuring chains, spoke of the railroad line that had to go through, no matter whose bones lay in the soil. "Abby." The voice came from the porch of the small, weathered house that served as both parsonage and home. Her father, Reverend Samuel Whitlow, stood in the doorway. He was a tall man, thinned by fasting and worry, his black coat hanging off his shoulders like a shroud. He held a Bible in one hand, his finger marking a verse as if it were a weapon he was ready to draw. "Get inside, girl," he called out, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to mask as authority. "Do not stand in the open when the devil is knocking." Abby hurried toward the house, the water sloshing over the rim of the pail and darkening the hem of her calico dress. "Is it them, Father? Is it the raiders?" Samuel ushered her inside and bolted the heavy oak door. The interior was dim and stifling, smelling of old paper and beeswax. "It is the sound of failure. Abigail, the failure of words." He paced the small main room, agitated. Samuel was a man who believed that Scripture could turn aside arrows, and that reason could cool the blood of soldiers. He had spent 5 years trying to stand between the fort and the tribes, preaching a gospel of coexistence that fewer and fewer people wanted to hear. "I must go to town," Samuel said suddenly, grabbing his hat. "If there has been a skirmish, the council will be calling for blood. Sheriff Miller will not be able to hold back the mob without a voice of reason." "Father, no," Abby said, reaching for his arm. "You heard the shots. It is dangerous." "It is always dangerous to do right," he said, though his eyes darted nervously to the window. "Stay here. Keep the door barred until I return." He left her there in the shadows of the parsonage, a young woman who knew the geography of the Holy Land better than the geography of the territory she lived in. She knew the names of the apostles, but she knew almost nothing of the men who rode the ridges with painted faces, nor of the soldiers who drank whiskey in the saloons and looked at her with eyes that made her pull her shawl tighter. She was a virgin in the truest sense of the time, untouched, unlearned in the harsh commerce of the frontier, and terrified of the world that lay beyond the garden fence. But curiosity was a sin she confessed too often in her prayers. An hour after her father left, when the gunfire had ceased and an eerie silence returned to the valley, Abby unbarred the door. She had to know. She needed to buy flour, she told herself. It was a lie, but a necessary one. She saddled the old mare, strictly staying to the beaten path that led to the cluster of buildings that dared to call itself a town. Copper Creek was in an uproar. Men were gathering outside the sheriff's office, their voices raised in a cacophony of anger. Abby tied her horse behind the general store, keeping out of sight. She moved through the alleyways, the dust coating her tongue. She saw the bodies laid out on the boardwalk in front of the undertaker's parlor. 2 men, prospectors, by the look of their worn boots and pickaxes. An arrow was still protruding from the shoulder of one, its feathers matted with dried blood. "Savages," a man shouted. "They slaughtered them over a mile from the reservation line." Abby pressed herself against the rough wood of the livery stable, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw her father standing on the steps of the sheriff's office, his hands raised, pleading. "We must not act in haste," Samuel shouted over the crowd. "Retaliation will only bring war to our doorsteps. We must seek the lieutenant at the fort. We must talk to the chiefs." "Talk." The sneer came from a man standing near the water trough. It was Silas Thorne, the representative for the mining consortium. He was a heavy man in a suit that cost more than the church had earned in 10 years. "Talk does not protect my investments, preacher, and it does not bring these men back to life. Peace is a fine sentiment for Sunday morning, but it does not turn a profit on a Tuesday." Standing next to Thorne was a man Abby recognized with a shiver of dread. Captain Harlan Voss. He was the commanding officer of the local garrison, a man of impeccable uniform and polished boots. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. He was handsome in a severe, sharp-edged way, but his eyes were like chips of blue flint cold, unyielding and utterly devoid of warmth. "The Reverend is right about one thing," Voss said, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the noise. "We cannot have a disorganized war. It must be managed." "Managed," Thorne spat. "I want them gone. Captain, the railroad surveyors are refusing to work past the canyon. That land is full of silver, and I cannot get a shovel in the ground while those Apaches are breathing down our necks." Abby crept closer, moving to the side of the building where the window of the sheriff's office stood open to catch the faint breeze. She knew she should leave, but the tone of Voss's voice held her there. It was the tone of a serpent coiling. The men moved inside the office. Thorne, Voss, the sheriff, and her father. Abby crouched beneath a window, hidden by a stack of hay bales. "It is a tragedy," Voss was saying inside, "but perhaps an opportunity." "Opportunity," that was her father's voice, trembling. "Captain, 2 men are dead, and 200 will follow if we do not secure the territory," Voss replied. "Reverend, the War Department is tired of these skirmishes. They want a solution. I have received orders to secure the canyon for the railroad, but I cannot attack without provocation, or the newspapers in the East will cry foul. They love their noble savage stories." "So you want to provoke them?" Samuel asked, horror in his tone. "No," Voss said. "I want to lull them. I have a plan. We offer them a new treaty, a comprehensive one. We promise them the rights to the northern hunting grounds, safe passage, and food rations that actually arrive. In exchange, they allow the surveyors into the canyon." "They will never believe it," Thorne grumbled. "They know we want the silver." "They will believe it if we offer a token of supreme good faith," Voss said softly. "A marriage." Abby held her breath. The dust in the air suddenly felt like crushed glass in her throat. "A marriage?" Samuel asked. "Between whom? A union between our people and theirs." Voss continued. "It has been done before. It creates a blood tie, a hostage situation disguised as a sacrament. If we give them a bride, a white woman of good standing, they will believe we are serious about peace. They will honor the marriage bed. They will lower their guard. They will bring their families down from the high ridges to the signing ceremony." "And then?" Thorne asked, his voice greedy. "And then?" Voss said, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled Abby to the bone. "Once the surveyors are in position and the Apache are gathered in the open for the celebration, we will find a violation of the treaty. A stolen horse, a missing cow, anything will do. And we will crush them. We will clear that canyon in one afternoon." "That is monstrous," Samuel whispered. It is a betrayal of the highest order. And who would you sacrifice to such a fate? What woman would agree to this?" There was a silence in the room. A long, heavy silence that stretched until the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like hammer blows. "She does not need to agree, Samuel," Voss said. "She only needs to obey her father." Abby clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The world tilted on its axis. "No," Samuel said. "No, you cannot mean Abigail. She is a child. She is innocent." "She is the daughter of the peacemaker," Voss said, his voice hard now, stripping away the veneer of politeness. "Who else? A whore from the saloon. The Apache are proud. They would see the insult. It must be a woman of virtue, a woman of status. Your daughter is the only currency they will accept for this. Peace." "I will not do it," Samuel said. "Then you will hang." Thorne cut in. "Look outside. Preacher, the town is ready to burn your house down. They say you coddled the savages, and because of you, those prospectors are dead. If you do not give them this victory, this treaty, I will let the mob have you, and they will not be gentle. Think of it, Samuel," Voss added, his voice oily again. "You will be saving lives. You sacrifice one girl to save the town. Is that not the nature of your faith sacrifice?" Abby did not hear her father's answer. She pulled away from the window, her legs trembling so violently she nearly fell. She stumbled back toward her horse, her vision blurred not by tears, but by a sudden, terrifying clarity. She had always believed that peace was something prayed for, something sent from heaven like rain. Now she realized that to men like Voss and Thorne, peace was just a pause to reload. And to her father, peace was a desperate bargain. She rode back to the homestead in a daze. She did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears. She entered the house and looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror by the basin. The face looking back at her was pale, the eyes wide and dark. She looked at the blue calico dress she wore, the one she had sewn herself, taking pride in every stitch. She had dreamed of wearing a fine dress one day for a man who would court her with flowers and awkward conversation on the porch swing. Now, she saw herself not as a person, but as a coin. A piece of gold to be slid across a table to buy a month of silence for a mining company. Her father returned 2 hours later. He looked 10 years older. He did not look her in the eye. He sat at the table, his head in his hands. "Abby," he whispered. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady, surprising even her. "I heard them." Samuel looked up, his face streaked with tears. "They will kill me, Abby. They will burn the church." "So you sold me," she said. It was not an accusation, simply a statement of fact. No, I bought time." Samuel stood up, reaching for her, but she took a step back. "It is a marriage, Abby, a treaty marriage. You will be safe. They have laws about wives, and Captain Voss says that once the tension breaks, we can annul it. We can get you back." "Voss is a liar. Father," Abby said. "And you know it?" "I had no choice," Samuel sobbed. "We always have a choice," Abby said quietly. "You just made yours." She turned away from him and went to her small room. She did not pack a trunk. She did not have enough belongings to fill one. She took her mother's Bible, the leather cover worn smooth. She took a small sewing kit. She took a pouch of dried herbs she used for teas. And she took the heavy wool shawl, for she knew the nights in the Apache camps would be cold. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was not courage, exactly. It was the cold resolve of someone who realizes they are standing on a trap door. She looked at the window. The sun was setting, turning the sky the color of a bruise. "Peace is written on the bodies of women," she thought. "That is the scripture they never taught me." 2 days passed in a blur of agonizing waiting. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, the sound of hooves thundered into the yard. Abby walked out onto the porch. The dust cloud was massive, choking the air. Out of the haze emerged a column of riders. At the front was Captain Voss, sitting high on his bay gelding, his uniform immaculate. Beside him rode Sheriff Miller and Mr. Thorne. But behind them, separated by a gap of 10 feet that felt like 10 miles, rode the Apache. There were 6 of them. They did not look like the drawings in the Penny Dreadful novels. They looked lean, hard, and utterly practical. They wore buckskins that were stained with grease and earth. Their hair was long, held back by headbands of red cloth. They carried rifles that looked well used across their laps. They did not look at the soldiers. They looked at the house. Voss dismounted and walked to the porch, removing his hat with a flourish that made Abby want to spit. "Miss Whitlow," he said, "it is a fine day for a wedding." Abby did not look at him. She looked past him, to the group of Apache warriors. She tried to guess which one was the intended groom, but they all looked impassive, their faces like carved mahogany. One of them, a man near the back, sat on a horse that looked too thin, its ribs showing through its coat. He wore no silver, no paint. He looked poor, even by the standards of his own people. He was staring at the ground, his expression unreadable. Samuel came out of the house, carrying a small bundle of Abby's things. He tried to hand it to her, his hands shaking. "God go with you, child," he whispered. Abby took the bundle. She looked at the father who had raised her on sermons of love and then traded her for his own safety. She felt a severing in her heart, sharp and clean as a knife cut. "Goodbye, Father," she said. She did not say, "I love you." She could not. She stepped off the porch and into the dirt. Voss gestured to a soldier, who brought forward a horse for her. It was a mare with a side saddle, a concession to her civilized nature that felt like a mockery. "The papers are signed," Voss announced to the group, holding up a document. "The treaty stands. The girl goes with Nalan of the Chiricahua. The attacks on the wagon stopped today." One of the older Apache men said something in his own tongue, a guttural, flowing sound. He pointed to the young man on the thin horse, the one Abby had noticed. The young man, Nalan, looked up then. His eyes met Abby's. They were dark, intense, and filled with a simmering anger that terrified her. He did not look like a man who wanted a wife. He looked like a man who had been forced to take a burden he did not want, a man who had been shamed by his own poverty into accepting a white woman as a bargaining chip. He spat on the ground, then nodded once. "Mount up," Voss ordered. Abby pulled herself into the saddle. She adjusted her skirts, her fingers trembling. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the soldiers, the miners, the neighbors who had come to watch the spectacle. They did not see a tragedy. They saw a transaction. They saw their own safety purchased with her life. She looked at the horizon, where the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky. That was where she was going. Into the silence, into the unknown. "Today you go," she whispered to herself, repeating the words that had been ringing in her head since dawn. The column turned. Nalan kicked his gaunt horse into motion, and the Apache riders fell in around her. They did not speak to her. They simply absorbed her into their formation, a prisoner in a blue dress, as they rode past the property line. Abby did not look back at the house, or the well, or the father weeping on the porch. She looked ahead at the back of the man who was now her husband, a poor warrior with a hate-filled heart. The sun beat down, indifferent and cruel. The wind kicked up the red dust, covering the tracks of her old life as if she had never existed at all. The future stretched out before her, vast and terrifying, like a canyon she had to cross on a bridge made of spider webs. She took a breath of the hot air, tasted the grit of the earth, and rode on. The heavy thud of hooves against hard-packed earth marked the rhythm of Abigail's descent into hell. The homestead and the hypocrisy of Copper Creek had vanished behind a ridge of red sandstone, leaving her in a void of heat and silence. The ceremony that had bound her to this fate had not been a service with hymns and vows. It had been a transaction conducted at the edge of the wash, where the jurisdiction of the United States Army dissolved into the sovereign dust of the Chiricahua. There had been no priest. There had been no organ music. There was only the scratching of a pen on a government document held against a saddlebag, and the curt nod between Captain Voss and an older Apache leader who watched the soldiers with eyes like obsidian chips. It was a crude, jagged affair, devoid of sanctity. It felt less like a wedding and more like a surrender of arms. When the soldiers finally turned their mounts to ride back toward the safety of the fort, leaving Abigail alone with the 6 warriors, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. The older Apache man, whose face was a map of deep wrinkles and old scars, gestured toward the warrior who had been riding at the rear. The young man guided his horse forward. This was Nalin. For the first time, Abigail looked at him not as a terrifying abstraction, but as a man. The rumors in town painted the Apache as demons adorned in silver and blood. But Nalin was nothing like the penny dreadful illustrations. He was startlingly, painfully poor. He wore no silver armbands, no turquoise necklaces that the wealthier warriors displayed to show their prowess in raids. His shirt was a faded calico, patched at the shoulder with the rough stitching. His leggings were worn thin at the knees. But it was his horse that told the truest story. It was a small, grulla mare, her ribs showing through her dusty coat like the rungs of a ladder. She stood with her head low, exhausted, a stark contrast to the grain-fed mounts of the cavalry officers. Nalin himself looked as though he had been carved from mesquite wood and left in the sun too long. He was lean, bordering on gaunt, with high cheekbones that cast sharp shadows over his hollow cheeks. He did not look like a man who had won a prize. He looked like a man who had lost everything else and had been left with this unwanted duty. A scout who had ridden with the Apache group, a man of mixed blood, who smelled of tobacco and old sweat, spat on the ground and looked up at Abigail. "You understand what is happening, girl?" the scout asked in rough English. "I understand I have been sold," Abigail said, her voice trembling but her chin held high. The scout chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He pointed a thumb at Nalin. "This one is Nalin. He is not a chief. He is not a war leader. He has no wife because he has no ponies to give a father. He has nothing." Abigail glanced at Nalin. He was staring at the horizon, ignoring the conversation entirely. "The council chose him," the scout continued, enjoying the cruelty of the moment. "They said, if the white men want a marriage for peace, they can have Nalin. He has no family to mourn him if the soldiers lie and kill him. He takes you to stop the shooting. That is the trade." A wave of humiliation washed over Abigail, hot as the desert wind. She was not a peace offering to a great chief. She was a burden offloaded onto the poorest man in the band, a man who was expendable. Nalin turned his head then, his eyes locked onto hers. They were dark, impenetrable, and burned with a quiet, simmering intelligence. He said something to the scout, his voice low and guttural. "He says the sun is high," the scout translated. "He says you must ride." Abby felt a surge of defiance rise in her chest. It was the only thing keeping her from sliding off the horse and weeping into the dirt. She looked straight at Nalin, disregarding the scout. "Tell him," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the heat, "that I go because I must, not because I want. Tell him I am not a gift. I am a payment." The scout raised an eyebrow, but translated the words. Nalin listened, his expression unchanging. He looked at Abigail for a long moment, assessing her not as a woman, but as a creature that might bite. Then he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement. She had drawn a line in the sand, and he had seen it. Nalin kicked his leg over the neck of his mare and slid to the ground. He walked toward Abigail. She flinched, gripping the pommel of her saddle, her knuckles turning white. She expected him to grab the reins, to tie her hands, to assert his dominance as her captor husband. Instead, he stopped 5 feet away. He gestured to her stirrup, then to the ground. He was waiting for her to dismount and adjust her own girth, or perhaps he was simply giving her space. He did not touch her. He did not grab the bridle. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, his body angled slightly away from her, offering her a strange, silent autonomy. Abby realized he was waiting to see if she could handle her own mount. It was a test. She took a breath that tasted of sage and fear. She unhooked her leg from the side saddle's horn and slid down. Her knees buckled as her boots hit the uneven ground, the stress of the morning catching up to her. In a flash, Naelin's hand shot out. He did not grab her arm. He simply held his open palm inches from her elbow, a steadying presence, ready to catch her if she fell, but refusing to make contact unless necessary. Abby steadied herself. She looked at his hand, brown, calloused, scarred, hovering near her sleeve. She straightened her spine and nodded. Naelin withdrew his hand instantly, as if her dress were made of fire. He turned his back to her, checked the cinch of his own saddle, and then mounted in one fluid motion. He looked down at her, waiting. Abby climbed back onto her horse. She would not be the weak link. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Let us go," she whispered to the empty air. The journey into the stronghold was a revelation of devastation. For years, Abigail had sat in the pews of her father's church and listened to the townspeople speak of the Apache raids. She had heard of burning wagons, stolen cattle, and the savagery of the tribes. She had built a picture in her mind of a civilized land under siege by wild animals. But as they rode deeper into the canyonlands, where the red rock rose like the walls of a cathedral, the narrative began to fracture. They passed the entrance to a narrow box canyon. The smell hit her first, a sickly, sweet stench of decay that the dry air could not fully mask. Naelin did not stop, but his shoulders tensed. Abby looked to her left. Scattered across the canyon floor were the blackened skeletons of wickiups. The brush shelters burned down to ash. Among the charred remains lay the carcasses of horses, shot and left to rot. And there were mounds of earth, fresh and hastily dug, marked only by piles of stones. "What is this?" she asked, though there was no one to answer her but the wind. It was not a settler's homestead. It was an Apache winter camp. She saw a child's doll made of buckskin lying half buried in the sand, its beaded face scorched. She saw broken pottery. She saw the absolute, methodical destruction of a home. The town had never spoken of this. Captain Voss had never mentioned the raids the soldiers made on sleeping villages, killing the livestock to starve the people into submission. Abby looked at Naelin's back. He rode with his head high, refusing to look at the ruins of his people's lives. She realized then why his horse was so thin, why he wore no silver. It was not just poverty, it was survival. They were a people being hunted to extinction. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She was not entering a den of monsters. She was entering a refugee camp. The sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and blood orange. The temperature plummeted with the speed of a falling rock. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a biting chill that seeped through Abigail's thin calico dress. They made camp in a sheltered alcove near a trickle of water that wept from the rock face. The other warriors spread out, vanishing into the shadows to stand guard, leaving Abigail and Naelin alone by the small fire Naelin built. This was the moment she had dreaded since the papers were signed. The wedding night. Abby sat on a flat rock, her arms wrapped around herself, clutching her mother's Bible so tightly the leather was warm against her palms. She watched Naelin unsaddle the horses. He moved with an economy of motion, rubbing down the gaunt mare with a handful of dry grass, whispering soft words to the animal in his own tongue. It was the first time she had heard him speak gently. When he finished, he approached the fire. He carried a rolled bundle of animal hides. He dropped them on the sand near the fire, spreading them out to create a sleeping mat. Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. She was 19. She knew the duties of a wife, whispered to her by the older women in town. She knew what was expected. She looked at the single sleeping mat, panic rising in her throat. Naelin looked at her. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, making them unreadable. He looked at the mat, then at her, and then he seemed to understand the terror radiating from her. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of dried meat and a small canteen. He placed them on a rock halfway between them. Then he took his own blanket, a rough gray wool thing issued by the government reservation agency, and walked to the edge of the firelight, 10 feet away. He sat down with his back to her, his rifle laid across his knees, facing the darkness of the canyon mouth. He was not coming to the mat. "You—" Abigail started, her voice cracking. Nayland did not turn. He remained a silhouette against the stars, a sentinel guarding the perimeter. Abby realized with a jolt that he was guarding her, or perhaps he was guarding himself from her. He had created a boundary, a wall of silence and space. He was rejecting the rights the treaty gave him. The relief was so profound it nearly made her dizzy, but it was followed by a strange confusion. He did not want her. The man who had been forced to marry her saw her not as a prize to be claimed, but as a political object to be transported. Abby moved to the furs he had laid out. They smelled of smoke and wild sage. She sat down, pulling her shawl tight. The cold was biting now. She opened her Bible, seeking comfort in the familiar verses, but the words swam before her eyes. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, yipping sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Another answered it. The wildness of the land was closing in. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, unsure if he could hear her, or if he would even understand the English words. Nayland did not move. He sat as still as the stones, watching the dark. In the small space of the firelight, there was fear. Yes, but there was also space. Enough space to breathe. Enough space to remain herself for one more night. They rode for 2 more days, climbing higher into the Dragoon Mountains where the air was thin and sharp. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley. This was the stronghold. It was not a town. It was a scattering of wickiups made of brush and canvas, tucked into the crevices of the rocks like bird nests. Smoke curled lazily from the cooking fires. Children ran between the shelters, playing a game with sticks and a hoop. As Nalin led the group down the trail, the camp grew quiet. The playing stopped. The women looked up from their grinding stones and their tanning racks. Abby felt the weight of their gazes. There was no curiosity in their eyes. There was only hard, cold judgment. They saw her blue dress, her pale skin, her straw bonnet. They saw the color of the soldiers who burned their winter food. They saw the face of the people who stole their land. Nayland rode straight to the center of the camp and stopped. He dismounted, and this time, he did not wait for Abby. He walked to her horse and held the bridle, anchoring the animal. Abby slid down, her legs stiff and aching. She stood beside her horse, feeling small and exposed. A woman stepped forward from the nearest wickiup. She was young, perhaps Abby's age, with hair that shone like a raven's wing and eyes that flashed with open hostility. This was Ayita. She wore a dress of buckskin that fit her like a second skin, and silver bracelets chimed on her wrists. She was clearly of higher status than Nayland. Ayita looked Abby up and down, her lip curling in a sneer. She said something to the other women, her voice loud and sharp. The women laughed, not a joyful sound, but a cutting one. Abby did not need a translator to understand the tone. She is weak. She is ugly. She is the enemy. Nalin stepped between Abby and Ayita. He did not speak, but he stood there, a physical barrier. He was not protecting Abby out of affection. She knew that. He was protecting his own honor. He had brought this thing into the camp, and he was responsible for it. Ayita glared at Nalin, then spat at the ground near Abby's boots, before turning on her heel and stalking away. Welcome home, Abby thought bitterly. Nayland took the reins of Abby's horse and led it toward a small, solitary wickiup at the edge of the camp, far from the central fire. It was isolated, just like him. Abby followed him, clutching her Bible against her chest like a shield. She walked past the rows of hostile faces, past the children who hid behind their mothers' skirts, and stepped into the shadow of the brush shelter. She was the enemy in the house, the white woman in the heart of the Apache Nation, and she had never felt more alone in her life. The first week in the stronghold was not a descent into violence, as Abigail had feared, but a descent into invisibility. She had expected to be a prisoner, shackled and guarded. But instead, she found herself to be a ghost. The Apache people did not look at her. They looked through her. It was a calculated erasure, a collective decision to deny her existence even as she walked among them. The isolation was absolute. Naylin would leave the wickiup before the sun bled over the canyon rim, joining the other men for hunting or scouting patrols, leaving Abigail alone in a world she did not understand. She was left to the mercy of the camp's women, and they had none to give. They did not speak to her, but they left tasks for her. If she stepped out of the brush shelter, she would find a heavy basket made of woven willow dropped at her feet. If she ignored it, a stone would be thrown not to hit her, but to land with a sharp crack near her boot. A reminder. She would pick up the basket and follow the line of women down the steep, treacherous trail to the creek. The work was grueling. The water vessels were made of pitch-covered basketry or clay, and when full, they weighed enough to make her shoulders scream. Abigail's hands, once accustomed to the needle and the hymnal, blistered and bled. The red dust of the canyon worked its way into the cracks of her skin, stinging like salt. And always, there was Aita. Aita was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a hawk in flight. She was the daughter of a respected warrior, and she made it her personal mission to ensure the white woman knew her place. Aita did not just ignore Abigail. She performed her disdain. One afternoon, as Abigail struggled to haul a bundle of mesquite wood back to the camp, her foot caught on a root. She fell hard, the wood scattering across the path. Laughter erupted from the shade of a nearby mesquite tree. Aita stood there with two other young women, pointing and mimicking Abigail's fall, exaggerating her clumsiness. Abigail scrambled to gather the wood, her face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them she was the daughter of a reverend, that she could read Latin and play the piano. But here, those things meant nothing. Here, value was measured in how much wood you could carry and how quietly you could walk. She was worthless currency. The stress of the constant hostility, combined with the abrupt change in diet, finally broke her constitution. They ate a gruel made of mesquite beans, roasted agave hearts that tasted of smoke and molasses, and meat that was often tough and gamey. Abigail's stomach rebelled. 3 days into the second week, she collapsed. She had been trying to mend a tear in her calico skirt when the world tilted sideways. The gray canvas of the wickiup spun, and darkness rushed in. She woke to the sensation of being lifted. It was Naylin. He had returned early from the hunt. He did not cradle her like a lover. He carried her like a soldier carrying a wounded comrade efficiently, without wasted movement. He ducked into the wickiup and laid her on the furs. Abigail retched, her body heaving with dry sickness. Shame flooded her. She was weak. She was proving them right. Naylin did not look away in disgust. He knelt beside her, his face impassive. He took a gourd ladle, dipped it into a water jar, and held it to her lips. "Drink," he said in English. The word was rough, unused. She drank, choking slightly. He wiped her chin with the back of his hand, a gesture that was not tender, but practical. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not smooth her hair. He simply ensured she did not die. It was a duty. She was part of his household, however unwanted, and if she died of neglect, it would be a stain on his honor. For 2 days, she lay in the feverish grip of illness. Naylin came and went. He brought her broth. He kept the fire small and smokeless. He sat by the entrance, whittling a piece of ironwood, his presence a silent anchor in her drifting consciousness. On the third morning, a shadow fell over her. Abigail opened her eyes to see an old woman standing over her. Her face was a landscape of deep canyons, her skin like weathered parchment. Her hair was entirely white, tied back with a strip of red cloth. This was Enda, the grandmother of the band, a woman whose authority seemed to vibrate in the air around her. Enda leaned down, her eyes sharp and black. She poked Abigail in the ribs with a bony finger, making a clicking sound with her tongue. Then, Her hand moved to Abigail's waist. She felt the rigid boning of the corset beneath the dirty calico. The old woman let out a bark of laughter that sounded like dry leaves rasping together. She said something to Nayland, who was standing outside. Nayland ducked his head in. "She says you wear a cage." "It is proper," Abigail whispered weakly. Nanda did not care for propriety. With surprising strength, she pulled Abigail into a sitting position and began to unbutton the back of the dress. Abigail tried to protest, to cover herself, but Nanda swatted her hands away as one would swat a foolish child. The corset was stripped off and thrown into the corner of the wickiup with a look of utter contempt. Nanda then rummaged through a pile of hides and tossed Abigail a loose tunic made of soft cotton, likely obtained from trade or a raid. "Breathe," Nayland translated, though the old woman's pantomime of taking a deep breath was clear enough. Nanda grabbed Abigail's chin, forcing her to look up. The old woman's expression softened. Just a fraction. She tapped her own chest. Then Abigail's. "Heart." She tapped her head. "Mind." She pointed to the corset in the corner and made a cutting motion across her throat. "That life is dead," she was saying. "If you wear the cage here, you die too." It was the first lesson. As Abigail's strength returned, the dynamic shifted. She could no longer afford to be the silent victim. Nanda began to visit daily. She did not speak English, but she taught with her hands. She showed Abigail how to grind the mesquite beans without crushing her fingers. She showed her which insects were dangerous and which roots could stop bleeding. And Nayland began to teach her words. It happened while he was repairing a bridle outside their shelter. Abigail was scraping a hide, a task Nanda had assigned her. The smell of the raw skin was revolting. But Abigail clamped her jaw and worked the scraping stone. Nayland watched her for a moment. He pointed to the water jar. "Two." Abby looked up. Two, he repeated. Then he pointed to the fire. Ko, she echoed. He did not smile. He was arming her. "Tu, ko, zil," he pointed to the mountain. "Chill," he pointed to the brush. "Why?" she asked him during a pause. "You have ears," Nayland said, not looking at her. "If you do not know the words, you are deaf. A deaf woman is easy to kill." He taught her more. He taught her the words for run, hide, and silence. He taught her the Spanish words for horse and knife, the lingua franca of the borderlands. It was not the language of love. It was the vocabulary of survival. But knowledge did not bring safety. As Abigail became more competent, Aida's hostility deepened. The novelty of the white doll was wearing off, replaced by irritation that the doll was learning to walk. The explosion happened at the community, well, a natural spring that trickled into a rock basin at the base of the cliff. Water was life. In the drought of high summer, every drop was measured. Abby had waited her turn in line. She had filled her clay jar carefully, knowing how heavy it would be. As she lifted it to her hip, turning to leave, Aida stepped into her path. It was not an accident. Aida bumped Abigail's shoulder hard. Abby stumbled. The clay jar slipped from her sweat-slicked hands. It hit the rocks with a sickening shatter. The water, 3 gallons of precious, cool water, splashed across the dry red earth and was instantly swallowed by the dust. The silence that fell over the spring was terrifying. The other women stopped their work. Wasting water was a sin greater than theft. Aida looked at the wet stain on the ground, then back at Abigail, a smirk playing on her lips. She said something loudly in Apache, gesturing to Abigail's clumsiness. Something inside Abigail snapped. It was the sound of the parson's daughter dying and something else being born. She looked at the shattered shards of the jar. She looked at her bleeding hands. She looked at Aida's smug, beautiful face. "No," Abigail said. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud. She stepped forward, invading Aida's space. She pointed a finger at the other woman's chest. "You," Abigail said in English, then switched to the words Nayland had drilled into her. "Indi, you," she pointed to the wet ground. "Indi to you, water. It was broken, child like Apache." But the meaning was clear. "You did this." The women gasped. The white captive had spoken. Aida's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed into slits. She shoved Abigail backward. "Inda," she hissed. "White enemy." Abby did not retreat. She shoved back. It was an ungraceful, desperate shove, but it caught Aida off guard. Aida stumbled, her moccasin catching on a rock, and she fell onto her backside in the dust. For a heartbeat, there was shock. Then, Aida screamed in rage. She launched herself at Abigail like a mountain lion. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fabric. It was not a dignified struggle. It was scratching, hair-pulling, rolling in the dirt. Abigail felt Aida's nails rake across her cheek. She felt the fabric of her calico dress tear at the shoulder with a loud rip. She tasted blood where her lip split against her teeth. But Abigail fought. She fought with the rage of a girl sold by her father. She fought with the anger of a woman treated like a dog. She grabbed a handful of Aida's hair and yanked. She kicked out blindly. Enough. The voice was a thunderclap. Strong hands grabbed the back of Abigail's dress and hauled her up as if she weighed nothing. Another pair of hands grabbed Aida. Abby stood panting, her chest heaving. Her dress was ruined, the sleeve hanging by a thread, exposing her shoulder and the white shift beneath. Blood trickled down her chin. Nayland stood between them. He had been returning from the horses and had heard the commotion. His face was a mask of cold fury. He did not look at Abigail. He looked at Aida. Aida stood up, dusting herself off, ready to launch into a defense, to blame the clumsy white woman. Nayland cut her off with a sharp, guttural command. He stepped close to her, his voice low and vibrating with menace. He spoke in Apache, but the tone required no translation. He was scolding her. He gestured to the spilled water, then to Abigail, then to himself. The other women watched, eyes wide. Nayland was a poor warrior. Yes, he had no status, but he was a man, and he was asserting his right. Abby caught a few words she recognized. Izazan, wife, she, mine. He was not claiming he loved her. He was claiming that an attack on her was an insult to him. He was placing her under his shadow. Aida looked from Nayland to Abigail. Her face flushed with humiliation. To be scolded by Nayland, the man who had nothing, was a bitter pill. But she saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had been pushed too far. She turned and ran, disappearing into the brush. Nayland turned to Abigail. For the first time, she saw something other than indifference in his eyes. He looked at her torn dress, her bleeding lip, her wild hair full of twigs. He did not look angry at her. He looked impressed. He reached out and brushed a thumb across her cheek, wiping away a smear of dirt. The touch was brief, electric. "You fight ugly," he said in English. Abby let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "She started it." "I know," Nayland said. "Come." He did not walk 10 paces ahead of her this time. He walked beside her. That evening, as the sun went down, Nayland returned to the wickiup carrying a bundle. He tossed it onto Abigail's lap. It was a dress, not woven cotton, but buckskin. It was soft, cured to a velvet finish, and dyed a pale yellow with earth pigments. It had long fringe on the sleeves and a simple beaded pattern at the collar. Abby ran her hands over the leather. It was heavy, durable. It was the clothing of this land. "The blue cloth is dead," Nayland said, sitting by the fire to clean his rifle. "It scares the horses." It was a lie. The blue dress didn't scare the horses. It was his way of saying she looked like a victim in it. Did you trade for this?" Abby asked. She knew he had nothing to trade. "My grandmother," he said. "And made it. She said the cage wearer needs a new skin." Abby held the dress up. It was beautiful in its simplicity. "Thank you," she said. "Put it on," he said. "The wind is cold tonight." Abby changed in the back of the wickiup. When she emerged, the transformation was startling. The buckskin fit her form, moving with her rather than fighting against her. She felt heavier, more grounded. She looked at Nayland. He looked up. His eyes lingered on the fringe, on the way the leather laced at the front. A flush rose on Abby's neck, not of shame, but of a sudden, confusing awareness of his gaze. "Good," was all he said. Night fell hard and fast. The wind howled through the canyon. rattling the brush walls of the shelter. Usually, Nayland would take his blanket and go outside to his guard post, sleeping in the lee of the wickiup entrance. Abby lay on the furs, listening to the wind. She thought of him out there, in the cold. She thought of how he had stood between her and Aita. She thought of the water he had given her when she was sick. He was her husband. The word felt strange, jagged, but he was also her only ally. She sat up. "Nalin." There was a silence, then a low grunt from outside the flap. "It is... The wind is very bad tonight," she said to the canvas wall. "The fire is warm inside." She waited. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was an invitation. Not to a bed, but to a shelter. It was an admission that she did not want him to freeze. The flap pushed aside. Nayland ducked in. He brought a gust of cold air with him. He looked at her, his face shadowed. He stood there for a long moment, filling the small space with his presence. The wickiup suddenly felt very small. "The wind is bad," he agreed quietly. He did not come to her furs. He moved to the opposite side of the small fire pit, near the entrance. He laid his blanket out on the hard earth. He placed his rifle within easy reach of his hand. He lay down and turned his back to her, just as he had on the trail. But he was inside. Abby lay back, pulling the buffalo robe up to her chin. The fire crackled softly between them. She could hear his breathing, steady and slow. She looked up at the smoke hole, where a single star was visible. She touched her swollen lip. It throbbed, but the pain felt real. It felt like ownership. She was no longer the girl who cried in the parsonage. That girl had been left in the dust at the spring. She was someone else now. She was a woman who could scrape hides, who could speak the words of the enemy, and who could fight for her place in the dirt. She turned her head slightly to look at the dark shape of Nayland's back. He was a stranger, a warrior, a man who had married her out of hate. But tonight, he was just a man sleeping across the fire, and she was just a woman watching him, wondering what lay beneath the silence. "Good night, Nalin," she whispered. He did not answer, but she saw his shoulders shift, settling into the earth. The distance between them was still there, measured in feet and history, but the wall had a crack in it, and through the crack, the light was getting in. The decision to take Abigail on the hunt was met with a silence colder than the wind sweeping down from the Dragoon Mountains. It was 2 weeks after the incident at the spring. The camp was low on meat. The winter rations promised by the treaty had never arrived. Halted by bureaucratic red tape or, more likely, diverted into the pockets of the Indian agent. The band needed to hunt to survive the coming frost. Nalin stood by his gaunt mare, tightening the cinch. Beside him, Abigail waited. She wore the buckskin dress Enda had given her, and over her shoulders was a heavy woolen serape she had woven herself on a crude loom under the old woman's instruction. She looked less like the parson's daughter and more like a creature of the high desert, but to the other men, she was still a bad omen. "She brings the white man's smell," a warrior named Kale said. Spitting into the dust, he was older, scarred, and held on to the old hatreds like precious stones. "The deer will run before we even see them. Why do you bring this burden?" "Nalin." Nayland did not look up from his saddle. "She eats the meat. She should know how it bleeds. And if I leave her here, Aita will put scorpion weed in her soup." It was a grim joke, but no one laughed. Nayland swung onto his horse and looked down at Abigail. "Mount up. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open." Abigail climbed onto her horse. She knew she was unwanted. She could feel the resentment radiating from the 6 other men in the party. But she also knew that staying in the camp without Nalin was dangerous. The women had stopped throwing stones, but their silence was a loaded weapon. They rode out in a single file, heading north toward the high mesas where the grass was still sweet enough to hold the buffalo or the elk. The terrain was brutal. They climbed steep shale slopes where the horses had to scramble for purchase, and they descended into box canyons where the shadows swallowed the light at noon. For 2 days, they found nothing but tracks that were days old. The mood of the party darkened. A hungry Apache was a patient hunter. But a hungry husband with a family waiting was a desperate one. On the third afternoon, the wind changed. It carried the scent of pine resin and musk. Nolan held up a hand. Halting the column, he pointed toward a narrow draw a mile away. "Bison," he whispered. "A straggler. A bull." The men dismounted, leaving the horses with a young boy who acted as the holder. Nayland looked at Abigail. "Stay with the horses." "I can shoot," she said softly. Her father had taught her to use a rifle to keep coyotes off the chickens. "This is not a chicken," Nayland said. "Stay." He left her. Abigail watched them creep forward, disappearing into the sagebrush like ghosts. She waited, her heart thumping against her ribs. The silence of the high country was immense. Then, the world exploded. A gunshot cracked the air, followed by a roar that shook the ground. Dust billowed from the draw. The men were shouting not the disciplined calls of the hunt, but the frantic yells of something gone wrong. Abigail did not think. She kicked her horse into a gallop. Ignoring the boy's shout of protest, she rode toward the dust. As she crested the rise, she saw the chaos. They had cornered a massive bull bison, an old solitary male with shoulders like a mountain and horns that spanned 4 feet. Nayland had fired, but the bullet had only grazed the beast's flank, maddening it. In its rage, the bull had turned not on Nolan, but on the youngest member of the party, a boy of 16 named Chayton. Chayton's horse had panicked and thrown him. Now, the boy was scrambling backward in the dirt, his rifle lost. As 2,000 pounds of fury charged him, the other men were too far away or trying to control their spooked mounts. Nayland was reloading his single-shot Springfield, his hands a blur, but he would not be fast enough. Abigail saw the geometry of death clearly. The bull would crush Chayton before Nolan could fire. She screamed a high, piercing sound that cut through the dust. She drove her mare straight down the slope, placing herself between the bull and the fallen boy. She did not have a gun in her hand. She whipped off her heavy woolen serape and snapped it in the air like a flag. "Hey, hey!" she shrieked. The bison, confused by the sudden movement and the flash of color, skidded in the dirt. It swung its massive head toward her, its small eyes burning with hate. It forgot the boy. It wanted the horse. The bull charged her. Abigail wheeled her mare, kicking its flanks. The mare, terrified, leaped forward. The bison's horn missed the mare's haunch by inches, catching the edge of the saddle blanket. The force of the passing beast nearly unseated Abigail, but she clamped her legs and rode. She led the bull away from Chayton, drawing it into the open. A second shot rang out. The bison stumbled. It took another step. Then its front legs buckled. It crashed into the earth with a sound like a falling tree, sliding in the dust before coming to a stillness. Abigail pulled her shivering mare to a halt. She sat there, gasping for air, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the reins. Silence returned to the mesa. Nayland lowered his rifle. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel. He looked at the dead bull, then at Chayton, who was climbing to his feet, pale and shaking. Finally, he looked at Abigail. He did not smile, but the look on his face was one she had never seen before. It was the look a man gives a comrade who has just stood on the firing line beside him. Cale rode up to Chayton, checking the boy for injuries. Then, the old warrior turned his horse toward Abigail. He stopped 5 feet away. He looked at the white woman who was supposed to be bad luck. "You ride well," Cale grunted. For a woman with no sense, it was the closest thing to a compliment she would ever get from him. They butchered the bull where it fell. By the time the meat was dressed and packed onto the horses, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The wind that had been cold all day suddenly developed teeth. "Storm," Nolan said, looking at the clouds boiling over the peaks. "We cannot make the pass tonight." They sought shelter in a shallow overhang at the base of a limestone cliff. It was not a cave, merely a scoop in the rock that offered protection from the wind, but little else. The temperature dropped with terrifying speed. Snow began to fall, not soft flakes, but hard pellets of ice that stung like buckshot. They built a fire, but the wind was relentless, sucking the heat away before it could reach them. The men huddled together in their buffalo robes. Abby had lost her serape in the confusion of the hunt. It lay somewhere out in the sagebrush, trampled by the bison. She had only her buckskin dress. She sat near the fire, wrapping her arms around her knees, her teeth chattering with a violence she could not control. The cold of the high desert was not passive. It was predatory. It seeped into her bones, numbing her fingers and toes. She felt her mind growing sluggish. A shadow fell over her. Nayland stood there. He was wearing a heavy buffalo robe, the fur thick and dark. He looked down at her shivering form. He did not ask permission. He did not hesitate. He sat down behind her and opened the robe like a great wing. "Come," he said. Abby froze. The teachings of her father, the whispers of the town spinsters, all screamed in her head. A man who is not your husband in the eyes of God, but he was her husband, by the law of the treaty and the law of the land. She hesitated, and Nayland made a sound of impatience. He reached out, grabbed her arm, and pulled her backward. He wrapped the robe around both of them, enclosing them in a cocoon of fur and darkness. The shock of his body heat was intense. He was a furnace against her frozen back. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the slow, steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. The smell of him filled her senses: wood smoke, cured leather, and the musk of a man who had worked hard and bled. "Sleep," he commanded. "If you shake, you let the cold in." Abby tried to hold herself stiff, to maintain a barrier of propriety even inside the robe, but the cold was too strong, and his warmth was too inviting. Slowly, her muscles unlocked. She leaned back against him. The storm howled outside, a white curtain erasing the world. But inside the robe, it was quiet. Abby felt a strange sensation unfurling in her stomach. It was not fear. It was a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She was 19, and she had never been this close to a man. She felt the roughness of his tunic against her cheek. She felt his breath stirring her hair. She shifted, turning slightly so she could see his face in the dim firelight. His eyes were open, watching the flames. "Why?" she whispered. "Why what?" His voice was a rumble in his chest that she felt against her own. "Why did you agree?" she asked. "To take me, to marry me. You hate us. I see it in your eyes every day." Nayland looked down at her. His face was inches from hers. In the darkness, the sharp angles of his features were softened. "Yes," he said. "I hated you. Then why—" He was silent for a long time. The wind shrieked against the stone. "I had a wife," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a tombstone. "Before, her name was Sake. 3 winters ago. The blue-coat soldiers came to our winter camp while the men were hunting. They burned the food. They took the women." Abby stopped breathing. "When I came back," Nayland continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "She was dead, but before she died, they had used her, like a thing, like a resource." He looked at Abby, his eyes dark with the memory. "So when the captain offered a white woman," Nayland said, "I wanted it. I wanted to take one of their women. I wanted to make her walk in the dust. I wanted to make her carry the wood. I wanted her to feel what Psyche felt. Helplessness, fear. I wanted to look at a white woman and see a slave." Abby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She tried to pull away, but the robe held her. "Is that what I am?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A punishment." Nayland looked at her. His gaze moved over her face, the soot on her cheek, the fear in her eyes, the lips that had cracked in the dry air. "That is what I wanted," he said. "Revenge, a mirror to hold up to the white man." He shifted, his arm tightening around her waist beneath the robe. It was not a threatening grip. It was protective. "But desire is a trickster," he murmured. "It changes the shape of things." "I don't understand," Abby said. "Tonight," Nayland said, "when the bull charged, I did not see a white woman. I did not see an enemy. I saw you. I saw the woman who fought Ayita. I saw the woman who rode into death to save a boy who hates her." He leaned closer. His forehead touched hers. His skin was hot. "And now," he whispered, "holding you. I do not want you to suffer. I do not want you to be a slave. The hate is leaking out, and something else is filling the space. Abby's heart was hammering so hard she thought he must feel it. The confession was terrifying, yet it broke something open inside her. He was not a monster. He was a man wounded so deeply that he had tried to become the thing he hated, and failed. She looked at his mouth. It was a severe mouth, rarely given to smiling, but it was close. The desire she had been suppressing, the confusion of her own body reacting to his strength and his heat, surged up. She wanted to bridge the gap. She wanted to heal the wound he had just shown her. She moved her hand, touching his chest. She tilted her head up. Her lips brushed against his. It was a tentative, frightened invitation. Nolan's breath hitched. For a second, his hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her closer. The hunger in him was palpable, a starving thing waking up. Then he stopped. He pulled back, creating an inch of space that felt like a mile. His breathing was ragged. "No," he rasped. Abby flinched, stung. I am your wife." "Not like this," Nayland said. His voice was firm, though his hand on her waist was trembling. "You are shaking." "Abigail." "I am cold," she lied. "You are afraid," he corrected. "You offer this because you think it is the price for the robe, or because you think it will keep you safe, or because you are grateful I did not let you freeze." He moved his hand from her neck to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I do not want gratitude," he said, "and I do not want payment. The soldiers took my first wife by force. If I take you while you are afraid, then I am no better than the men who killed her." He looked deep into her eyes, stripping away her defenses. "I do not want the forced part to be in your body," he said. "When we lie together, it will be because you choose it. Not because of the cold, not because of the treaty, but because you want me as much as I want you." Abby stared at him. Tears pricked her eyes. In the civilized town of Copper Creek, no man had ever spoken of a woman's choice. A wife was property, a duty. Here, in a cave with a savage, she was being offered a dignity she had never known. "You want me?" she whispered. "I have wanted you since you stood up in the dust and told me you were not a gift," Nayland admitted. "But I will wait." He pulled her head down to his chest, tucking her under his chin. He wrapped the robe tighter, sealing them against the storm. "Sleep now," he said. "The fire is dying." Abby lay against him, listening to the wind die down. The rejection should have humiliated her, but instead, it made her feel cherished. He had seen her vulnerability and refused to exploit it. She closed her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a slow, burning certainty. He was right. She was not ready, but she knew, with the intuition of the heart, that the day would come when she would not be shaking. They slept, entangled, his legs bracing hers, his arm a heavy weight of protection across her ribs. The next morning broke clear and cold, the sky a piercing blue. The snow lay in drifts against the sagebrush. They dug out from the overhang, stiff and sore, but alive. The ride back to the stronghold was different. Nayland did not ride ahead. He rode beside her. They did not speak much, but the silence was companionable, not empty. When they rode into the camp, the meat laden on the pack horses, the people came out to watch. They saw the buffalo meat enough to feed the band for weeks, and they saw Chayton, the son of a respected family, alive and whole. Chayton slid from his horse and spoke to his father, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. He pointed to the dead bull's head strapped to a pack animal. He pointed to Abigail. He made a motion of riding between death and life. The murmur went through the crowd. It changed from a grumble to a hum of wonder. The white woman saved him. She rode against the bull. Aida stood by her wickiup, watching. She did not sneer. She looked at Abigail with a confused, sullen respect. Abby dismounted. Her legs were trembling from exhaustion. Nayland was there instantly, his hand on her elbow to steady her. He did not care who saw. "Go to the fire," he said. "I will handle the horses." Abby walked toward their wickiup. For the first time, No one turned their back on her. An old woman nodded as she passed. A child stared, open-mouthed. She had left as a burden. She had returned as a provider, but 40 miles away, in the polished office of the fort commander, Captain Harlan Voss was not celebrating survival. He stood by the window, looking out at the parade ground. A scout stood behind him, hat in hand. "You are certain?" Voss asked. "She is alive." "Yes, sir," the scout said. "Saw them coming down from the high country. They had meat, and the girl, she was riding with them. Like she belonged." Voss turned, his face tightening. This was not the plan. The girl was supposed to be a victim, a martyr whose tragic death at the hands of savages would incite the war he needed to clear the canyon for the silver mines. If she survived, if she actually brokered peace, the railroad investors would pull their funding. "She adapts too well," Voss murmured. "It seems the Reverend's daughter has gone native." He walked to his desk and picked up a pen. "If the Apache will not kill her," Voss said softly, dipping the pen in the inkwell, "then we must create a situation where they have no choice. Or better yet, where she appears to betray them." He began to write. The peace had lasted too long. It was time to strike a match. The peace that Captain Harlan Voss had engineered was a lie written in ink, but the war he desired was written in fire. It was late October, 1875. The air in the Dragoon Mountains had turned brittle with the coming winter, carrying the scent of pine resin and dying sage. For Abigail, the morning began not with the sun, but with a nausea that rolled through her stomach like a slow tide. She sat up in the darkness of the wickiup, pressing a hand to her abdomen. She had missed her monthly bleeding twice now. The realization terrified her as much as it anchored her. She was carrying a life in a land that seemed bent on dealing death. Beside her, Nayland slept with the lightness of a wolf, his hand resting near the revolver he had traded 3 pelts for at the last gathering. The distance that had once defined their sleeping arrangement had evaporated. They lay under the same buffalo robe, their bodies fitting together like pieces of broken pottery mended with gold. The silence of the pre-dawn was shattered by a sound Abigail had not heard since leaving Copper Creek. A bugle. It cut through the canyon, sharp and brassy, the herald of civilization and slaughter. Nayland was moving before the first note faded. He kicked the buffalo robe aside, grabbing his rifle and the ammunition belt. "Get up!" he hissed. "Abby, get up!" Outside, the world turned orange. The dull thump of torches hitting dry brush was followed instantly by the roar of flames. The screams began a heartbeat later high, piercing shrieks of women and the confused cries of children waking up to an inferno. Abigail scrambled into her moccasins, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed her medicine bag and the knife Nalin had given her. Nayland shoved her toward the back of the wickiup, slicing the canvas wall with his knife to create an exit away from the main entrance. "The wash," he commanded, gripping her shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Go to the deep wash behind the camp. Do not stop. Do not look back." "Where are you going?" she screamed over the noise of gunfire that had begun to crackle like dry wood in a fire. "To buy you time," Nayland said. He did not kiss her. There was no time for tenderness. He shoved her through the slit in the canvas and turned back toward the entrance, running straight into the chaos. Abigail tumbled out into the cold air. The camp was a nightmare. Soldiers on horseback, the United States cavalry, were riding through the cluster of shelters, firing pistols and swinging sabers. The smell of burning canvas and black powder stung her eyes. She ran. She kept low, moving behind the burning structures toward the rocky incline that led to the safety of the wash. Around her, other women were running, dragging children by their arms. Ahead of her, a figure stumbled and fell. It was Enda, the old grandmother. She had tripped over a grinding stone, and now she lay in the dust, trying to crawl as a rider in a blue uniform bore down on her, his saber raised. "No!" Abigail screamed. The instinct to survive screamed at her to keep running, to protect the child growing inside her, but the woman lying in the dust was the one who had given her the buckskin dress, who had taught her which route stopped infection, who had shown her that she could be more than a victim. Abigail did not run to the wash. She ran to Enda. She reached the old woman just as the horsemen arrived. Abigail grabbed a handful of dirt and flung it with all her strength into the horse's face. The animal reared, whinnying in surprise. The trooper, thrown off balance, cursed and sawed at the reins. "Get up," Abigail yelled, hauling Enda to her feet. "Nda, Njan." The trooper steadied his mount and looked down. He saw a white woman in Apache leathers, her face smeared with soot. Confusion flickered in his eyes, followed by recognition. "The captive," he shouted to someone over his shoulder. "I found the captive." He spurred his horse forward, reaching down not to kill her, but to grab her. He wanted a prize. Abigail shoved Enda toward the rocks. "Go!" The trooper's hand closed on Abigail's shoulder, his fingers digging into the leather. "Got you, girl. Stop fighting. I'm saving you." "I don't want to be saved," Abigail shrieked. She twisted, but his grip was iron. Desperation flooded her veins. She was not the parson's daughter anymore. She was the wife of Nalin. She reached for the knife at her belt. It was a tool for skinning rabbits, sharp and curved. She drove the blade into the man's forearm. It was a messy, frantic strike. The trooper howled and released her, blood spurting onto his blue sleeve. He looked at her with shock that quickly turned to murderous rage. He drew his pistol. "You savage bitch!" he spat. Abby froze. She stared down the black bore of the revolver. Time seemed to stretch, thin and terrible. She placed a hand over her stomach. A blur of motion slammed into the horse's flank. It was not Nalin. It was Ayita. The young Apache woman had emerged from the smoke like a fury, wielding a heavy club made of mesquite wood. She swung it with both hands, striking the trooper's knee with a sickening crunch. The man screamed and fell from his saddle. Ayita did not stop. She stood over him, raising the club again, but another shot rang out, kicking up dirt at her feet. More soldiers were coming. Ayita looked at Abigail. There was no hatred in her eyes now. The fire had burned it away, leaving only the solidarity of the hunted. "Run!" Ayita shouted in English, a word she had likely learned just to warn her enemies, but now used to save her sister. Together, they dragged Enda into the cover of the boulders. The deep wash was filled with smoke, but it offered cover. Women and children were huddled there, crying silently. "Stay here," Abigail told Ayita. "Where do you go?" Ayita grabbed her arm. "Nalin," Abigail said. "He is still out there. He fights for us," Ayita said. "If you go back, you die." "If I don't go back, I am already dead," Abigail replied. She left the safety of the rocks and crept back toward the burning camp. The heat was intense. She moved like a shadow, using the smoke as a veil. She reached the edge of the central plaza, where the fighting was thickest. The Apache warriors were outnumbered 3-1. They were fighting a retreating battle, trying to draw the soldiers away from the wash. In the center of the melee, she saw Captain Harlan Voss. He was not fighting. He sat on his high horse, observing the slaughter with the detached interest of a man watching a play. He looked immaculate, his uniform buttoned to the chin, a stark contrast to the blood and grime around him. And she saw Nalin. He was on foot, his horse likely killed. He was fighting 2 soldiers with his rifle used as a club. Blood was streaming down the side of his face from a cut on his forehead. As Abigail watched, a 3rd soldier struck him from behind with a rifle butt. Nalin went down to one knee. "Hold!" Voss's voice cut through the din. "Hold fire on the buck." The soldiers circled Nalin, their pistols drawn. Nalin tried to rise, but one of them kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling into the dust. Voss rode forward, looking down at the fallen warrior. Then, his eyes lifted and scanned the burning wreckage. "Come out, Abigail," Voss shouted. "I know you are here. I did not burn this rat's nest to the ground just to leave you behind." Abby stepped out from behind the burning remains of a wickiup. She walked into the open circle. She held her bloody knife at her side, but her head was high. "I'm here, Harlan," she said. Her voice was steady, though her knees felt like water. Voss smiled. It was a cold, triumphant expression. "Mrs. Whitlow, you look terrible, but we will get you cleaned up. A bath, a proper dress, and you will forget this nightmare ever happened." "This is not a nightmare," Abigail said, gesturing to the dead bodies scattered on the ground. "This is a crime. This is justice," Voss corrected smoothly. "These savages killed a prospector 3 days ago. They broke the treaty. I am merely restoring order." "You lie," Abigail said. "You killed him yourself, or you paid someone to do it, just as you said you would in the sheriff's office." Voss's smile faltered. He glanced at his men. They looked uneasy. They were soldiers, not executioners, and shooting women and burning homes sat ill with many of them. "You are hysterical," Voss said dismissively. "Trauma does that to a woman's mind. Come here. Get on the horse." He gestured to an empty mount. Abigail did not move toward the horse. She moved toward Nalin. He was conscious, struggling to breathe, blood bubbling at his lips. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear, not for himself, but for her. "Go," he mouthed. Abigail knelt beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Then she stood up and placed herself between Nalin and Voss. "I am not going anywhere with you," she said. Voss's face hardened. "Step aside, Abigail. That man is a combatant. He is to be executed for insurrection." "He is my husband," Abigail said. The words rang out clear and absolute. "He is a dog." Voss spat. "And you have degraded yourself enough. Look at you, dressed in skins, smelling of smoke. You are a disgrace to your race." He walked his horse closer, leaning down. "And what is that I see? You hold your belly like a wounded animal." He stared at her abdomen, and the realization dawned on him. His face twisted in disgust. "You are pregnant," he whispered, loud enough for his men to hear. "You carry a mongrel child." "I carry a child," Abigail said. "And he will not be born in a cage." Voss straightened up. He drew his revolver. "Then he will not be born at all. If you choose the savage, you die with the savage. It is a tragedy, the report will say. The captives were killed by their captors before we could rescue them." He cocked the hammer. Nalin let out a roar. He lunged forward, grabbing Abigail's ankle to pull her down, to shield her with his own broken body. But before Voss could pull the trigger, a sound rolled down from the canyon walls. It was not a bugle. It was a war cry. Hundreds of voices. Voss looked up. On the ridge overlooking the camp, a line of warriors appeared against the rising sun. They were not Chiricahua. They were Mescalero, a neighboring band. Inda had known. The old woman had read the signs in the movement of the soldiers days ago and had sent runners. "Flank!" a sergeant screamed. "Captain, we are flanked!" Arrows began to rain down a dark sleet that hissed through the air. A soldier near Voss grunted and fell with a shaft in his neck. Panic broke the formation. "Retreat!" Voss screamed, his composure shattering. "Fall back to the wash, no to the river!" The soldiers wheeled their horses. The discipline of the drill field vanished in the face of an overwhelming force on high ground. Voss looked at Abigail one last time, his eyes burning with a promise of future violence. "This is not over. Abigail," he shouted, "I will hunt you to the ends of the territory." Then he spurred his horse and galloped away into the smoke, his men scrambling behind him. The thunder of hooves faded, replaced by the crackle of fire and the moans of the wounded. The Mescalero warriors did not pursue far. Their goal was to save the survivors, not start a massacre they could not finish. Abigail dropped to her knees in the dust. The adrenaline drained out of her, leaving her trembling. She turned to Nalin. He was pale, his skin turning a grayish hue under the dirt. The kick to his chest had broken ribs. But the real danger was a gunshot wound in his thigh that she hadn't seen until now. The dark blood was pulsing out in a steady rhythm. "Nalin," she whispered. "Stay with me. Abby," he rasped. You stayed." "I chose," she said fiercely. She ripped the hem of her buckskin dress, but the leather was too tough to tear into bandages. She looked around frantically. She saw a bundle that had been dropped in the chaos. It was her own saddlebag, miraculously unburned. She tore it open. Inside was her sewing kit and the white linen shift she had worn under the dress, the last remnant of her life in Copper Creek. She pulled out the white cloth. With her teeth and hands, She tore it into strips. She pressed a pad of linen against the wound on his leg, leaning her entire weight on it to stop the bleeding. "The bleeding! It is deep," Nayland grunted, his eyes fluttering shut. "Keep your eyes open," Abigail commanded. "Listen to me. Nalin, you do not get to die. Not after I fought a soldier for you. That would be rude." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Rude. The bleeding slowed, but the wound gaped open. It needed to be closed. Abigail opened her sewing kit. She took out a needle, a fine steel needle meant for embroidery. She took a spool of heavy thread. "This will hurt," she said. "I am Apache." Nayland whispered, "Pain is my brother." "Then introduce me to your brother," she said, her hands shaking as she threaded the needle. She worked. She drove the needle through the tough skin, pulling the edges of the wound together. She used the stitches Nda had taught her for closing water skins, combined with the precise, small stitches her mother had taught her for repairing lace. It was a grotesque fusion of two worlds, sewn into the flesh of the man she loved. Aita appeared beside her, bringing a bowl of water and a poultice of chewed roots. She did not speak. She simply washed the blood from around the wound as Abigail stitched. When the last knot was tied, Abigail sat back, her hands covered in blood. Nayland had passed out from the pain, but his breathing was steady. The Mescalero leader rode into the center of the ruined camp. He looked at the destruction, then at the white woman kneeling in the blood and dust, holding the hand of the fallen warrior. The sun had fully risen now. It illuminated a wasteland of ash. The winter food was gone. The shelters were gone. They had won the battle, but they were homeless in the face of winter. Abby looked down at her hands. The blood on them was mixed Nalin's blood, the soldier's blood, and her own. She placed a hand on her stomach. Voss was gone, but he was right about one thing. He would come back. The war had truly begun. She looked at Nalin's sleeping face. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, tasting salt and smoke. "Let him come," she whispered to the wind. "We will be ready." The wind that scoured the temporary refuge of the Mescalero band was not merely cold. It was a thief. It stole the warmth from the few blankets they had salvaged. It stole the moisture from their lips. And it stole the hope that had briefly flared after the victory at the burned camp. Abigail sat near a small, smokeless fire, watching the sun struggle to rise over the Dragoon Mountains. It had been 3 days since the attack. They were alive, but they were starving. Voss had burned the winter stores. The game in this high, rocky terrain was scarce, and every time the hunters went out, they risked running into a cavalry patrol. They were being herded. Voss was not attacking directly again. He was simply tightening the noose, waiting for hunger or winter to finish what his bullets had started. Abigail looked at Nalin. He was lying on a pallet of cedar boughs, his leg wrapped in the linen she had torn from her undergarment. He was burning with fever. He had insisted on standing guard the previous night, leaning heavily on a crutch made of driftwood, refusing to look weak in front of their Mescalero hosts. Now, the infection she had fought so hard to stitch closed was knocking at the door again. She realized then that running was a slow form of dying. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her buckskin skirt. She walked to the saddlebags she had saved. Inside, tucked between layers of leather, was the evidence she had gathered the ledger page she had found months ago in the ruins of a prospector's shack. And more importantly, a sworn affidavit she had written herself, signed by Thomas, the blacksmith in Copper Creek, during a secret trade meeting weeks prior. It detailed the bribes Voss had taken from the mining consortium. She began to saddle the Grula mare. "What are you doing?" The voice was weak, raspy, but filled with an edge of steel. Nayland had opened his eyes. He was trying to push himself up on one elbow. "I am going to the fort," Abigail said. She did not look at him, focusing on the cinch. "No," Nayland growled. He tried to rise, but his leg buckled, and he collapsed back with a hiss of pain. "You do not go to the Wolf's Mouth to ask for mercy." "I am not asking for mercy," Abigail said, turning to face him. "I am going to stop him. Voss wants a war in the shadows. He wants us to die quietly in these canyons, so he can write a report saying we froze to death or killed each other. I'm going to turn on the lights. He will hang you, Nayland said. He will say you are a traitor. He cannot hang me, Abigail said, placing a hand on her rounded stomach. Not while the world is watching, and I intend to make sure they are watching. You are a warrior, Nayland whispered, his eyes bright with fever and fear. But this battle, you cannot win it alone. Do not leave me. Abigail knelt beside him. She brushed the hair back from his hot forehead. I am also a warrior in my own way. Nayland, you fight with a rifle. I fight with the truth. If I stay, we all die. If I go, we have a chance. She kissed him. It was a desperate, salty kiss. Then she mounted the mare and rode out before he could summon the strength to stop her. The ride to Fort Bowie was a journey through a landscape of tension. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Abigail rode openly, keeping to the main wagon road. She wanted to be seen. She wanted witnesses. When the wooden palisades of the fort came into view, the sentries shouted in alarm. They raised their rifles, expecting a raid. What they saw confused them. A lone rider, dressed in Apache skins, but with the braided hair and pale face of a white woman. Hold fire, a sergeant bellowed. Abigail rode straight to the main gate. She sat tall in the saddle, despite the exhaustion that dragged at her bones. I am Abigail Whitlow, she announced, her voice ringing clear in the thin air. I am a citizen of the territory. I wish to speak to the commander. The gates groaned open. She rode into the parade ground. It was a different world from the starving camp. There was the smell of roasting beef, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer, the sight of well-fed horses. The injustice of it burned in her throat like bile. Soldiers stopped their drills to stare. They looked at her buckskins, her darkened skin, the knife at her belt. They whispered, the captive, the traitor, the savage lover. Captain Harlan Voss stepped out onto the porch of the headquarters. He was wiping his mouth with a napkin, having just finished a midday meal. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed, and a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. He had expected to hunt her down, not have her ride into his stronghold. Well, Voss said, descending the steps, the prodigal daughter returns. I assume you have come to your senses and are ready to identify the hostiles who held you. Abigail dismounted. She did not hand her reins to the stable boy. She tied the horse herself. I am here to file a formal complaint. Captain, she said, against you, for the murder of the prospectors, the burning of the winter camp, and the illegal pursuit of a peaceful people. The soldiers nearby went silent. Voss's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Seize her, Voss ordered quietly. 2 guards stepped forward, grabbing Abigail's arms. They were rough, twisting her wrists behind her back. You are under arrest for treason, Voss said, stepping close to her. For aiding and abetting the enemy. For taking up arms against the United States Army. I am a civilian, Abigail shouted, struggling. I demand a hearing. You are a spy, Voss hissed, close to her ear. And spies hang? Then hang me, Abigail challenged him, thrusting her stomach forward. Hang a pregnant woman in the middle of the parade ground. Do it, Harlan. Let every man here see what kind of hero you are. Voss flinched. He looked around. The enlisted men were watching. Private James Collins, the young soldier who had once looked at her with pity, was standing near the water trough, his face pale. Voss knew he could not execute her. Not here, not yet. Throw her in the stockade, Voss commanded. And if she speaks a word to anyone, gag her. The cell was a small, windowless room at the back of the guardhouse. It smelled of unwashed bodies and damp earth. They took her knife. They took her saddlebags. But they did not strip-search her, perhaps out of some lingering Victorian modesty, or perhaps because Voss assumed a savage woman carried nothing of value. He was wrong. Abigail had hidden the folded affidavit and the ledger page inside the lining of her moccasin. Hours passed. The darkness was suffocating. Abigail paced the small cell, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3, turn. She thought of Nalin. Was he still alive? Had the fever taken him? The heavy door creaked open. A soldier entered carrying a tray with a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack. It was Private Collins. He set the tray down on the small stool. He did not look at her. He turned to leave. "James," Abigail said softly. He froze. He had not heard his first name spoken in months. "You were there," Abigail said. "At the burning. You saw the old woman fall. You saw Nalin trying to protect me." "I have my orders." "Mrs. Whitlow," Collins said, his voice tight. "Orders to kill women." Abigail asked. "Orders to starve children. Is that why you signed up? James, to be a butcher for a mining company." Collins turned. His young face was tormented. "The captain says you are bewitched. He says the Apache turned your mind." "Look at me," Abigail commanded. "Do I look bewitched, or do I look like a woman who is tired of watching good men die for bad reasons?" She reached into her moccasin and pulled out the papers. She unfolded the affidavit signed by Thomas. "This is proof," she said. "Proof that Voss is taking money from the Silver Syndicate. Proof that he started this war for profit. If this gets out, he is finished." Collins looked at the paper. "He will kill you before he lets that leave the fort." "I know," Abigail said. "That is why I need you." She moved to the bars. "I need to send a wire to the governor in Tucson and to the Arizona miner in Prescott." "I can't," Collins whispered. "That's court-martial. That's firing squad." "And if you do nothing?" Abigail asked. "Then you're just another one of his guns. You have a soul. James, I saw it in your eyes the day you let me pass at the gate. Don't let him kill it." Collins stood there for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at the door. He looked at Abigail's swollen belly. He looked at the papers in her hand. "The telegraph operator is a civilian," Collins said hoarsely. "Mr. Higgins, he doesn't like the captain much." "Take me to him," Abigail said. "I can't take you out," Collins said. "But I can take the message." "Write it down." Abigail shook her head. "No, I need to be sure. Take me to the office. Say I needed the latrine. Say I fainted. I don't care. Just get me to the wire." Collins took a deep breath. He unlocked the cell door. The walk across the compound was the longest journey of Abigail's life. It was dusk. The shadows were long. Collins marched her at gunpoint, keeping up the charade, but his hands were shaking on his rifle. They reached the small shed that housed the telegraph key. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and tobacco. Mr. Higgins, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, looked up in surprise. "Privy escort," Collins muttered, shoving Abigail inside and locking the door behind them. "Mr. Higgins," Abigail said, wasting no time. "I have money, and I have a story that will make you famous." She slapped a gold coin onto the table, a coin Da had given her, taken from a dead soldier years ago. "Send this to Governor Safford." "Priority 1, she ordered. Higgins looked at the coin, then at Abigail. He knew who she was. The whole territory knew who she was. "Dictate," Higgins said, his fingers hovering over the key. Abigail took a breath. To Governor Safford, from Abigail Whitlow. Held at Fort Bowie by Captain Voss. I am pregnant and imprisoned to silence witness of massacre orchestrated to seize Apache land for silver interests. I have proof of bribery and conspiracy. If I am dead tomorrow, it is murder by federal troops. The key began to click. Tuck, 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 tuck. The sound was louder than a cannon. It was the sound of the truth traveling at the speed of lightning. "Now the press," Abigail said. "To the editor of the Arizona Miner." The door burst open. Voss stood there, flanked by 2 guards. His face was a mask of fury. "Stop that transmission," he roared. Higgins did not stop. He hammered out the last few words. "Federal troops." Voss drew his pistol and shot the telegraph machine. Sparks flew. The key shattered. Higgins jumped back, hands raised. "That is federal property. Captain, you are under arrest," Voss screamed. He turned his gun on Abigail. "And you You have signed your death warrant. It is too late. Harlan, Abigail said, leaning against the desk for support. The wire is gone. The governor has it. The operator in Tucson has it. You can kill me, but you cannot kill the signal. Voss raised the gun. His finger tightened on the trigger. Collins stepped forward, raising his rifle not at Abigail, but slightly across Voss's line of fire. Captain, Collins said, his voice trembling. You can't shoot her. Not here. Not with a witness. Voss looked at Collins with pure hatred. You are done. Private. Maybe, Collins said. But the wire is sent. Voss lowered the gun slowly. He knew he was trapped. If he killed her now, moments after a distress signal reached the governor, he would be hanged. Back to the cell, he snarled. Double guard. No food, no water. We will see how long the warrior lasts. 2 days passed. Abigail lay on the dirt floor of the cell, weak from hunger. She drifted in and out of sleep, dreaming of the wind in the canyon and Nolan's hands. On the morning of the 3rd day, the ground shook, not from artillery, but from the arrival of a heavy column of riders. Abigail dragged herself to the small grate in the door. She saw men in dusters, riding hard. They were not cavalry. They wore the silver stars of the United States Marshals and the badges of the Texas Rangers, who had crossed the territorial line under special jurisdiction. At their head was a man in a black suit, a federal magistrate. The shouting match in the courtyard was muffled, but Abigail heard the tone of authority. Voss was shouting about jurisdiction. The magistrate was shouting about a federal warrant. Minutes later, the cell door was thrown open. The magistrate stood there. He was an older man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier. Mrs. Whitlow, he asked. Yes, she croaked. I am Magistrate Miller. I have an order for your immediate release into protective custody. Governor Safford sends his regards. Abigail tried to stand, but her legs failed her. Collins, who had been standing guard, dropped his rifle and caught her. I've got her, Collins said. As they led her out into the blinding sunlight, Abigail saw Voss. He was standing on the porch, stripped of his belt and saber. He was under arrest pending an inquiry. He looked at her with eyes that promised nothing but vengeance. This isn't over, he mouthed. Abby ignored him. She turned to the magistrate. I need a horse. I need to go back. Mrs. Whitlow, the magistrate said gently. You are malnourished. You need a doctor. I need my husband, Abigail said. And I need to bring the Apache leaders to the table. You want peace, I can give you peace. But only if I go back now. The magistrate looked at her, at the fire in her eyes that no prison could extinguish. I will give you an escort to the edge of the canyon, but we cannot enter. The mood is too volatile. I will go alone from the edge, Abigail said. She rode back to the mountains that evening. She carried food, bandages, and a document signed by the magistrate promising a ceasefire and a safe conduct conference at the old stagecoach station in 3 weeks. The return to the camp was not the triumphant entry she had hoped for. The silence was heavy. As she rode into the circle of wickiups, no children ran to greet her. The people sat by low fires, their faces streaked with ash and mourning. Aita came out to meet her. She looked older, her face drawn. Where is he? Abigail asked. Sliding from the horse, her heart seizing in her chest. He lives, Aita said, but the sickness is deep. Abigail rushed to the shelter. Nayland was lying on the furs. He was unconscious, his skin burning to the touch. The leg was angry and swollen. The exertion of the battle and the days of waiting had allowed the infection to rage back. But there was another empty space in the shelter, a pile of blankets that was gone. Inda, Abigail whispered. Aita stood in the doorway. She shook her head slowly. The night you left, her heart, it was too tired. She went to the ancestors. Abigail felt a sob tear through her throat. The old woman who had saved her, who had taught her to be Apache, was gone. It was the price of the war Voss had started. Abigail knelt beside Nolan. She checked the wound. It was bad, but not hopeless. She had medicine now, proper quinine and carbolic acid she had bullied the fort doctor into giving her before she left. She began to work. She cleaned the wound, forcing the medicine into the flesh. Nalin groaned, thrashing in his fever dreams. "Hold him," Abigail ordered Ayita. She worked through the night, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering to him in English and broken Apache. She told him about the telegraph. She told him about the magistrate. She told him about their child. "You do not get to die," she said fiercely, gripping his hand. "Do you hear me? Nalin, I did not walk into a prison cell just to come back to a widow's bed. We have a meeting. We have a treaty to write. You have to stand beside me." Toward dawn, the fever broke. Nalin opened his eyes. They were clear, though exhausted. He looked at Abigail, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the determination set in her jaw. "You came back," he whispered, from the wolf's mouth. "I told you," she said, leaning her forehead against his. "I am a warrior in my own way." "Nda," Nalin started. "I know," Abigail said, tears finally spilling over. "We will mourn her. But first, we have to live." She pulled the magistrate's letter from her tunic. "They want a conference," she said. "In 3 weeks. At the stage station, no soldiers, just the magistrate and us." Nalin looked at the paper. He did not trust it, but he trusted the woman holding it. "Voss?" he asked. "Under arrest," she said. "But he has friends. He has the mining money. He will try to stop this. Then we will be ready," Nalin said. He squeezed her hand, his grip weak but steady. "We still have the gun, and now we have the voice." Abigail looked out the entrance of the wickiup. The sun was rising, painting the red rocks with light. The war was far from over. Voss was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were the most dangerous kind. He would find a way to strike at the conference. He would try to turn the peace into a massacre. But as she felt the child kick inside her, Abigail knew one thing for certain. She was done running. The next time they met Captain Voss, it would not be as victims. It would be as the architects of his destruction. The stagecoach station at Apache Pass was a structure built for defense, with thick adobe walls and narrow slit windows designed for rifles. But on this November morning in 1875, the heavy oak doors were thrown wide open. A long table, improvised from rough-hewn planks set upon sawhorses, stood in the center of the dusty courtyard. On one side sat Magistrate Miller and a weary-looking colonel from the Department of the Arizona Territory. On the other side sat the elders of the Mescalero and Chiricahua bands, their faces painted not for war, but with the white clay of mourning and negotiation. Standing between them was Abigail Whitlow. She wore neither the blue calico of her past nor the full buckskins of her exile, but a combination of both. Her skirt was dark wool, practical and heavy, but her blouse was Apache deer hide, beaded at the collar. She stood with her hands resting on the edge of the table, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. Behind her, leaning on a cane but standing upright, was Nalin. He wore no weapon openly, but his eyes scanned the perimeter of the station with the vigilance of a hawk protecting its nest. Captain Harlan Voss sat at the far end of the table, stripped of his command sword but still wearing his uniform. He was technically under inquiry, but his influence ran deep, and he had demanded the right to face his accusers. He looked calm, almost bored, tapping a finger against the wood. "The terms are clear," Magistrate Miller said, his voice scratching against the dry air. "The Army agrees to a cessation of all punitive expeditions. In exchange, the bands agree to relocate to the designated zones south of the Gila River. No raiding, no interference with the mail route." The Apache elder spoke in his own tongue, a rapid, flowing river of sound. Abigail translated, her voice steady. "He says the land south of the river is rock and scorpion. It cannot feed the families in winter. If you put them there, you are only killing them slower than with bullets." "It is the best land available," Voss interjected smoothly. "Unless they prefer the prison at Fort Marion in Florida. I hear the humidity does wonders for the lungs." Abby turned to look at Voss. The agreement requires arable land, she said, and water rights. Without the creek, there is no treaty. There is only a pause before the next massacre. Voss smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. You speak as if you have leverage, Mrs. Whitlow. You are a woman who ran off with hostiles. The only reason you are not hanging is because the magistrate has a soft heart for sob stories. I have leverage, Abigail said, reaching into her pouch. She pulled out the ledger page and the affidavit signed by Thomas the blacksmith. She slammed them onto the table. I have the dates of the shipments. I have the names of the men you paid to murder the prospectors. And I have the signature of the man who forged the requisition orders for the ammunition you sold to the cartels in Mexico. The colonel picked up the papers. His eyebrows shot up. Voss's face darkened. He glanced toward the rocky ridge overlooking the station. It was a subtle movement, a mere flick of the eyes. But Nayland saw it. Down! Nayland roared. He did not reach for a weapon. He threw his body over Abigail, knocking her to the dirt just as a crack of thunder split the air. A bullet tore into the wood of the table, sending splinters flying exactly where Abigail's chest had been a second before. Chaos erupted. The Apache elders dove for cover. The soldiers guarding the perimeter raised their rifles, unsure where to aim. It's an ambush, Voss shouted, jumping to his feet. The savages are attacking, kill them all. He reached for the pistol of the soldier standing next to him, intending to turn the confusion into a bloodbath. No. The shout came from the roof of the station. Private James Collins stood there, his rifle raised. But he was not aiming at the Apache. He fired a single shot into the dirt at Voss's feet. Drop it! Captain! Collins screamed, his voice cracking with adrenaline. I saw the signal. I saw you signal the ridge. On the ridge, a scuffle broke out. 2 Texas Rangers, who had been positioned there by the magistrate as a precaution, emerged from the rocks dragging a man in a dusty duster coat, a hired gunman known to work for the mining syndicate. Voss froze. He looked at the gun at his feet, then at the colonel, whose face had gone purple with rage. Arrest him, the colonel ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Shackle him, and gag him if he tries to speak. 3 soldiers' men who had seen their friends die in Voss's manufactured wars pounced on the captain. They did not be gentle. Voss was slammed into the dust, his face pressed into the very earth he had tried to steal. Abigail pushed herself up, shaking the dust from her hair. Nayland was already standing, helping her to her feet. He checked her quickly, his hands running over her arms and shoulders. I am fine, she whispered. She turned to the table. The bullet hole was a stark black eye in the wood. That, Abigail said, pointing to the struggling Voss, was the last act of the war. Now, gentlemen, let us talk about the water rights. The magistrate looked at her with a newfound respect. He picked up the pen. The creek stays within the reservation boundary, he declared, and the winter rations will be distributed by civilian contractors, not the military. It was not a perfect victory. The Apache were still losing the vast freedom of the open range. They were still being confined to boundaries drawn by men in Washington who had never seen a cactus. But it was a life. It was a future. Abigail took the pen. She signed her name below the magistrate's. Then she handed the pen to Nolan. He hesitated. He looked at the paper, then at the horizon where the mountains rose purple and majestic. He knew this paper could not hold the wind. But he looked at Abigail's stomach, where his child lay waiting. He made his mark a jagged line that looked like a mountain peak. It is done, Nayland said. 2 years later, 1877, the settlement that had grown up near the old stagecoach station did not have a proper name on the map yet. Some called it the Crossing. Others called it Whitlow's Halt. It was a strange, hybrid place, a cluster of adobe houses, a corral, and a large trading post that smelled of coffee, raw wool, and sage. It was a place where the borders blurred. Apache women came down from the reservation lands to sell baskets and woven blankets. Prospectors stopped for supplies, learning quickly that if they caused trouble, they would answer to the silent, dark-skinned man who watched over the settlement like a guardian spirit. Abigail stood on the porch of the clinic she had built. It was a simple room attached to the main house, lined with jars of dried herbs and stocked with bottles of carbolic acid and laudanum. She wiped her hands on her apron. She had just set a broken arm for a cowboy who had been thrown by a Mustang. "That will hold," she told the man. "Keep it dry, and pay Tomas on your way out. He needs iron for the forge." The cowboy touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Mrs. Nolan." She smiled at the name. It was not how the town would have addressed her years ago, but here, it was a title of respect. She walked out into the sunlight. The desert was blooming after the winter rains, a carpet of yellow and purple flowers stretching toward the mesas. A child came running across the yard. He was a sturdy boy of 18 months, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes that held the blue of the summer sky. He wore a miniature buckskin tunic and ran with a joyous, tumbling gait. "Mama!" he shrieked, holding up a lizard he had caught. "Careful, Coo," Abigail said, scooping him up. Coo meant cloud in Apache, a bringer of rain and life. "Put him back. He has a family, too." Nayland came around the corner of the corral. He had filled out in the last 2 years. The gaunt, starving warrior was gone, replaced by a man of solid muscle and quiet authority. He wore canvas trousers and a cotton shirt, but his moccasins were traditional, and his hair was still long. He was leading a team of mules that had just brought supplies from Tucson. He stopped when he saw them, dusting his hands on his pants. He walked over and took the lizard from the boy, setting it gently on the railing where it scurried away. Then he took the boy from Abigail's arms, tossing him into the air until Coo shrieked with laughter. "Did the mules behave?" Abigail asked. "Better than the driver," Nayland said, a small smile playing on his lips. "He wanted to camp in the dry wash. I told him if he did, he would wake up swimming. He listened." Nayland set the boy down, letting him run back to his toys. He stepped closer to Abigail, blocking the sun. "Voss died," he said quietly. Abigail stiffened. "When?" "Last week, in the military prison at Leavenworth. Pneumonia." Abigail let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 2 years. The shadow was finally gone. "It is over," she said. "No," Nayland said, taking her hand. "The building is never over, but the fighting, yes, the fighting is done for today." That evening, the settlement quieted down. The lanterns were lit in the trading post where travelers shared stories. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a peaceful, rustling sound. In their bedroom at the back of the house, Abigail sat by the window. She was working on a small object by the light of a kerosene lamp. It was her mother's Bible. The cover had fallen apart years ago during the flight from the burning camp. Abigail had saved the pages. Now, she was sewing them into a new cover, a soft sleeve of deer hide. On the front, she was beading a cross, but the cross was stylized, surrounded by the 4 sacred directions of the Apache faith. Nayland entered the room. He had washed the dust of the trail from his skin. He wore only his trousers. He stood behind her, watching her hands work the needle. "2 gods," he murmured, touching the beadwork. "One truth," Abigail replied, "that we are supposed to take care of each other." She tied off the final thread and set the book down. She turned in her chair to face him. Nayland looked at her. He looked at the faint scars on her hands from the work she did every day. He looked at the silver streak that had appeared in her hair, a mark of the terror they had survived. He knelt before her, placing his hands on her waist. "Do you remember the storm?" he asked. "The night of the buffalo hunt?" "I remember," Abigail said softly. "I remember you said you would wait until I was not shaking." Nayland ran his hands up her sides, feeling the warmth of her skin through the cotton of her nightgown. "Are you shaking now, Abby?" Abigail reached out and traced the line of his jaw, the scar on his forehead where the soldier's rifle had struck him. "No," she whispered. "I am steady as a rock." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the battlefield, nor the tentative kiss of the cave. It was the deep, slow kiss of a man who knows he is home. It tasted of patience and a love that had been forged in fire. He lifted her from the chair and carried her to the bed. The linens were clean and smelled of lavender she had grown in her garden. He laid her down and lay beside her, his weight familiar and comforting. "I used to think I wanted to own you," Nayland whispered against her throat, his hand moving with reverence over her body. "To take you to settle a score. And now," Abigail breathed, arching into his touch, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. "Now," Nayland said, looking into her eyes with a raw, naked honesty. "I know that a man owns nothing in this world but his choices, and every day, when the sun rises, I choose you." Abigail pulled him down to her. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only the heat of two people who had bridged a chasm of blood and hatred to find a place where they could simply be a man and a woman. The desire that filled the room was heavy and sweet, a language that needed no translation. It was the final treaty, signed not on paper, but on skin and soul. The next morning, the sound of a hammer ringing against an anvil woke the day. Thomas was already at work. Abigail sat on the porch step, holding Koo on her lap. The boy was sleepy, rubbing his eyes. "Tell me a story." "Mama," he mumbled. Abigail looked out at the settlement. She saw a wagon rolling in, driven by a white man who waved at an Apache woman hanging laundry. She saw the schoolhouse she was building, the frame rising against the blue sky. "Once upon a time," Abigail began, her voice low and melodic, "there was a girl who lived in a house of fear, and there was a warrior who lived in a house of anger." "Did they fight?" Koo asked. "Oh, yes," Abigail said, smoothing his hair. "They fought the world, they fought monsters, and sometimes they fought each other." "Who won?" Abigail looked toward the corral, where Nayland was teaching a young colt to accept a halter. He moved with patience, his hand gentle on the animal's neck. He looked up. Sensing her gaze across the yard, he smiled, a true, open smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Love won," Abigail whispered to her son. "Because love is the only thing strong enough to break the cages we build for ourselves." The wind blew across the desert, carrying the scent of rain. It washed over the graves of the past and the foundations of the future. It was a wild, free wind, belonging to no one and everyone. Abigail held her son close and watched her husband walk toward them. The story was done, but the life was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and fire of the old frontier, and I hope Abby and Alan's journey touched your heart. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please drop a comment below and tell me which country or city you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button, and if you really want to support the channel so more people can hear these stories, please press the hype button. Your support keeps the campfire burning. Thank you, and see you on the next trail.